On Auschwitz. The history of Auschwitz is exceptionally complex. It combined two functions: a concentration camp and an extermination center in gas chambers. Nazi Germany persecuted various groups of people there, and the camp complex continually expanded and transformed itself. In the podcast On Auschwitz, we discuss the details of the camp's history and our contemporary memory of this unique place. The Auschwitz III Monowitz camp was established in October 1942 on the site of the displaced and expelled Polish village of Monowice, located 6 kilometers from the Auschwitz I camp. It was connected with the construction of the synthetic rubber and fuel plant by a German chemical company, IG Farben Industrie. Dr. Piotr Setkiewicz, head of the Memorial Research Center, talks about the history of the third part of the Auschwitz camp complex. Where did the decision to build a factory of synthetic rubber in Oświęcim came from?
Well, that was in 1940, after the first serious defeat of the German army, namely in the Battle of Britain. The higher command of Wehrmacht decided that they would need another third factory of synthetic rubber somewhere in the east, outside the range of the British bombers taking off from airfields in southern England. So that was the moment when the IG Farben representatives began to look for a suitable location for the factory, and the only viable place and most favorable for the needs of the factory, that was Upper Silesia in occupied Poland, because of its natural resources, because of the coal deposits, the numerous coal mines, and the coke quarry in Kressendorf, salt mine in Wieliczka. So in the end of 1940, the IG Farben representative arrived at Katowice, the capital of the province, and began to look for the site of the future factory. And then Auschwitz was chosen for many purposes, and there is a number of opinions about it, why particularly Auschwitz was chosen for this purpose. Some people believe that it was because that was a concentration camp here. But at the very beginning, more important were other factors, like the fact that Oświęcim was situated on the outskirts of the industrial basin of Upper Silesia. Therefore, it would be easier to find a labor force among the local population of the area and the villages nearby. Then River Vistula was here. That was necessary, the water from the river, to cool certain chemical installations in the future factory. Then, of course, it was the railway line that led from Oświęcim to Krakow, very close to selected site. So these were practical reasons why the IG Farben people drove their attention on Oświęcim.
But the presence of the concentration camp made the location in a way more favorable. It was a factor when they made the decision.
Yes, that was another favorable agent in the decision-making process, because as the people from the IG Farben stated, the resources of potential workers for the factory here in 1941 were almost exhausted. Many Polish farmers who lived around Oświęcim had been sent to Germany to perform slave labor there. There was also the problem with potential laborers in the city of Oświęcim, because approximately half of them were Jews who were to be removed from the area quickly, as that was the plan for massive settlement of Germans in this belt that surrounded the industrial region of Silesia. So there were many reasons why suddenly the people from IG Farben found out that the fact that there is a concentration camp here would be extremely helpful for the future. Nobody knows actually who, for the first time, proposed the using of prisoners of concentration camp on the construction site of IG Farben. That was most probably the local Arbeitsamt, the employment office. And very quickly the IG Farben people found out that this proximity of the concentration camp would be very beneficial for the future. That was probably in February 1941, when for the first time the IG Farben initiated negotiations with the headquarters of the concentration camp, as well as with the high-ranking officers and the personal staff of the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. What was most important for IG Farben, that was the fact that the SS proposed very low wages for the work of prisoners. That means that was 3 Reichsmark per day of work of a prisoner. That represented about the half of salary of German construction worker. So that was the first benefit. The second, the fact that prisoners had already been here. So there was no need to build for them any quarters. Then prisoners could now go for the vacations. In this case, the management of the factory would not be obliged to cover certain costs for organization of cultural life and all these things connected with the social care on the civilian workers. So these were the most important reasons why the IG Farben was very enthusiastic with the idea of employment of prisoners of the concentration camp. But also the people from the concentration camp, the SS officers, were extremely happy that such big company was interested in the future cooperation. Again, for many reasons. First of all, for Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler himself, that was a good argument for the propaganda that the SS is not only responsible for isolating the enemies of the Reich in the concentration camp, but also in this way, by hiring the prisoners to the private contractors, the SS would be engaged in the national-wide war effort. Then Himmler believed that this cooperation would be beneficial financially for the SS organization as well, because he believed that it would be possible to build a large workshops around the concentration camp, in which prisoners would be employed and their products like concrete posts for the future fence of the factory, like simple furniture, elements of wooden barracks, bricks or gravel. They all would be sold to the IG Farben and would bring the SS substantial profits. And finally, which was perhaps the most important, the fact that IG Farben was a large company, the biggest one in pre-war Germany, and had at its disposal a large amount of construction materials that were not available even for such a powerful organization like the SS itself. So SS believed that the IG Farben would give them, for the needs of the expansion of the concentration camp, a certain amount of bricks, cement, iron, whatever was necessary to expand the camp and increase its capacity. So that was why, during this initial talks between the representatives of IG Farben and the people from the concentration camp, both sides expressed their enthusiasm towards the idea of the future cooperation.
When did the first Auschwitz prisoners started actually working at the site of the future factory?
The first prisoners appeared on the site in April 1941. Several hundred prisoners were transported to Monowice by trucks. Then prisoners had to walk simply from the concentration camp to the construction site. The distance that was about 5 kilometers, but there were 2 problems with such a way of delivering prisoners to Monowice, because first of all, prisoners had to march along the city on the only bridge over the Sola River, and the residents of Oświęcim had a chance to see the prisoners, how exhausted, how poorly they looked like. And secondly, there was a problem with the constant fogs that appeared usually in this area, and that resulted in substantial delays in deliveries of prisoners to Monowice. For these reasons, the IG Farben in the end of June 1941 decided to pay for a shuttle train which would transport the prisoners directly from Auschwitz I to a railway station in Dwory, which was situated very close to the construction site. Of course, that means that IG Farben had to pay some more money, and the other problem was that because the railway lines that led from Germany to the Eastern Front were overcrowded, so the train had to wait sometimes even a couple of hours for the green light to go to Monowice and to deliver prisoners to the factory. Finally, the train had a limited capacity, particularly in the middle of 1942. It became obvious that this proved to be not so good as the IG Farben expected. So it was not possible to enlarge the train and to bring more prisoners to Monowitz, more than about 2,000. That was the maximal capacity of the train. And that was the reasons why the people from IG Farben began to look for the other solution.
The solution was to build a subcamp. Why exactly such a decision was taken?
There were two reasons. First of all, that was not possible to bring more prisoners each day to the construction site. However, the second and perhaps more important was the outbreak of typhus epidemics in the base camp in Auschwitz and in Birkenau in the middle of 1942. The camp was practically closed and prisoners could not simply be delivered to the construction site. So IG Farben people were very disappointed. They were looking for other sources of labor. They were in touch, for example, with the so-called Schmeltorganisation, that was the unit of SS responsible for labor camps for Jews in Silesia. But because Brigadeführer Schmelt finally refused, so the IG Farben were waiting for the end of epidemics. And in order to solve the problem of potential sources of typhus among the prisoners on the construction site, and that was a serious threat that the other civilian workers could be infected with typhus, IG Farben decided that they would sacrifice one of their precious barrack camps for the needs of the subcamp of Auschwitz. Apart from the Auschwitz concentration camp inmates, IG Farben employed a large number of forced laborers from Germany. These were the people who occupied the leading position in the factory, engineers, foremen, and so on. But also many thousand forced laborers from Poland, France, Netherlands, Denmark, Italy. In order to find the quarters for them, the IG Farben decided to build a number of barrack camps around the construction site. 3 of them were ready in the middle of the year, and the 4th one was under construction. So the IG Farben proposed to the SS that they would be ready to donate this camp for the needs of the concentration camp prisoners. Namely, they believed that because this camp would be isolated from the other parts of Auschwitz, so in this way they would be able to avoid spreading out typhus among the staff of the factory, in the way that the new arrivals to Auschwitz, new prisoners being brought to the Auschwitz concentration camp, they would be sent directly to Monowitz, without being registered in Auschwitz I, for example. That was this idea, and that was accepted by the high-ranking officers from Berlin, including Oswald Pohl, who was the head of the main economic office of the SS, and his deputy, Maurer, who was responsible for the question of prisoner employment. As we can see, in the nearest future, despite the fact that this idea was accepted by the leading figures in the structures of the SS in Berlin, so Rudolf Höss was not particularly understandable and did not work in favor of this option, because when these transports began to arrive to Auschwitz, these prisoners actually ended up in the main camp in Birkenau. They had to pass through the procedure of registration as much as all other prisoners, and in this way Höss broke this agreement which had been previously settled between the IG Farben and Oswald Pohl. So that was the starting point of the countless complaints and problems between the people from IG Farben and Commander itself. Finally, as we can presume, Höss was forced to send the first groups of prisoners from Auschwitz to Monowitz in October 1942. And what was perhaps more important, he had to send every day a report to Berlin with information about the number of prisoners who were employed on the construction site, who were sick, the number of the guards in Monowitz, and so on and so on. So the camp was opened. Initially, it consisted of about 20 barracks, and it was surrounded by a similar barbed wire fence as it was in the case of Birkenau.
What were the conditions in the camp, and did it develop, or the structure of the barrack camp that the IG Farben donated to Auschwitz was exactly the same throughout the time of the war?
Initially, the camp was relatively small, and it would accommodate slightly over 2,000 prisoners. But of course, the needs of IG Farben were larger. They wished to have more people for work. Gradually, prisoners of concentration camps built more and more barracks. In Monowitz, the end of the first initial phase of development in the middle of 1944. But if we look at the aerial photographs taken by the Allies in the fall of the year, we can see that the IG Farben began the construction of a new sector of the Monowitz camp. So if in the middle of 1944 the maximal capacity of Monowitz was estimated as to be around 11,000 people, so most probably 3,000 or 4,000 prisoners more might have been accommodated in the new sector of the camp. Altogether, IG Farben built 60 wooden barracks. They were marginally smaller than the barracks in Birkenau, and the conditions in these barracks were slightly better. First of all, these barracks had windows, and what is more important, had the central heating installations that had a certain significant impact on the situation of prisoners, because when they had their clothes wet, they could dry them on the pipes of these installations in the barracks. Nevertheless, if we wish to compare the situation of prisoners in Monowitz and in other parts of the Auschwitz complex, the most important feature was the mortality among the prisoners, which was almost equal to the mortality that prevailed in Birkenau. So despite these better living conditions, in Monowitz the number of deaths was practically the same. I believe that that was because of hard work on the construction site. If in the case of Birkenau, particularly in Auschwitz, we can see many prisoners who worked in certain institutions of the concentration camp, like warehouses or workshops and other such working places. Prisoners who worked there, they were somehow in privileged position. If we compare them with the others who had to perform very heavy manual works in the Außenkommandos outside the camp. So in the case of Monowitz, we've got almost 100% of prisoners who had to perform this hard manual labor on the construction site. The IG Farben promised to provide prisoners with additional amount of soup. That was so-called Bunnersuppe, but the value of the soup was very low and was comparable with the quality of soup being distributed among the prisoners in the concentration camp itself. All these factors resulted in almost equal mortality among Monowitz prisoners as well as prisoners in other parts of Auschwitz.
What kind of slave labor the prisoners had to do at the site of the IG Farben factory?
Well, these were ordinary works that were connected with the construction of buildings, streets, digging foundations of the buildings, the drainage ditches, laying electric cables. All these works are very hard, very exhaustive, including, for instance, transportation of construction materials from the train station to the storehouses of the factory. All these works required a lot of energy, and that was probably why the prisoners, very few of them had a chance to perform certain kind of skilled works that were better, if we assume their chances for survival.
When we look at the situation in Auschwitz, one of the elements of terror is the supervision of both the SS and the functionaries. Is the situation different in Monowitz because the prisoners were working for a private company, or the supervision of the prisoners in the SS also contributed to the death of many prisoners? The
system of guarding prisoners was the same in Monowitz. Initially, each individual commando or work detail would receive a certain number of guards. Then, with the end of construction of fence that covered the space of about 10 square kilometers inside the factory, the fence constituted a sort of large chain of guards, the Grosse Postenkette, that also existed in Auschwitz and in Birkenau. The only difference was that the SS guards, they stood by the gates that led to the factory together with the members of the security guards, the Werkschutz of the factory. And as much as it was in Auschwitz, individual commandos of prisoners had to work under the supervision of their capos. And only from time to time the commandos were controlled by SS officers, but perhaps what is more important, the commandos, the prisoners had to work being supervised by civilian foremen from IG Farben. Of course, it was in the interest of the foreman to be sure that the work would be completed until the end of the day. So if he could see that prisoners worked too slow, so he usually could go to the capo or to the SS man and said that, well, do something. They had to work faster, and therefore the capo would bring his stick and beat prisoners more energetically, as the IG Farben used to call this. In 1942, the IG Farben people began to complain that productivity of prisoners is too low, and therefore it is necessary to do something to increase it. And first of all, they stated that perhaps the SS men were not sufficient in numbers, or they did not understood the needs of work in the private industry. However, that met with very negative comments from the headquarters of the concentration camp. For example, the head of employment division, Heinrich Schwarz, answered that, well, IG Farben don't have to tell the SS how the SS guards should supervise the prisoners. Then the IG Farben proposed that perhaps it would be better to send to Monowitz a certain amount of very energetic German capos, German criminals or anti-social prisoners. And this idea was accepted by the SS, and in fact a certain number of a few hundred German criminals were selected among the prisoners in other German concentration camps and sent to Monowitz. So in this way, probably the way how the prisoners were supervised by the capos was more dangerous for prisoners in Monowitz than in any other parts of the Auschwitz complex. So these were the practical consequences of IG Farben attempts to increase the productivity and the profits for the company itself, because the IG Farben had to pay still the same amount of money, 3 Reichsmark per day of work of a prisoner.
Was the organizational structures of the Monowitz camp the same as in the whole Auschwitz complex, or were there any differences because of this cooperation with IG Farben and the fact that the camp stood by the factory site?
Officially, the camp in Monowitz became something like the first sub-camp of Auschwitz. It was called Lager Buna. Buna, that was a market name of the synthetic rubber that was to be the basic product of the factory. And the Lager Buna was subordinated directly to the commander of the Auschwitz camp. Then, in November 1943, when Auschwitz was divided into 3 semi-independent parts, the Monowitz became the headquarters of all sub-camps that belonged to the structure of Auschwitz III. Namely, they were the so-called industrial sub-camps that were located by the coal mines, steel works, and other such places in Upper Silesia. So, from one hand, the commander of Monowitz, Schwarz, was independent in the way how he believed that his camp should be run, but on the other, commander of Monowitz was some ways subordinated to the commander of Auschwitz I, the base camp, which was also commander of the SS garrison. So the structure was to a certain extent complicated, nevertheless that worked, and I cannot see any problems or differences in cooperation between Kommandantur or headquarters in Monowitz and authorities of the Auschwitz complex in Auschwitz I.
You mentioned that IG Farben used different sources of laborers, not only prisoners of the concentration camps, but also slave laborers from different countries in occupied Europe, but also German workers. What was the nature of the contacts between the prisoners of Auschwitz and the civilians who were present at the IG Farben plant?
That depends on practical considerations, to which extent the prisoners could see, contact, and even sometimes talk to the civilians. Of course, formally such contacts were forbidden. Nevertheless, assuming the large size of the factory and the fact that there were many hidden places where the prisoners could not be controlled by the SS men or the capos, these contacts were more frequent than the contacts with civilians in Auschwitz or the Birkenau camps. we can see the whole variety of possible ways how the German workers, German civilians reacted. Of course, that was a number of those Germans who treat the prisoners in a very brutal way. Sometimes happened that the IG Farben foreman might beat prisoners if the couple was not good enough. On the other hand, that was a case of the formal protest that these were not people from the IG Farben itself, but a group of German workers from a company called Schulze. And this company was a subcontractor of IG Farben. So some workers from this firm decided to come to the office of Maximilian Faust, who was the chief engineer and deputy of the director of the factory, and they openly protested against beating prisoners almost to their death on the construction site, and they stated that they do not want to see such things any longer. As far as I know, that was the only protest of the German civilians in the entire region of Upper Silesia during the war. However, of course, it did not bring any results because Mr. Faust was hostile towards not only prisoners but even the Polish civilians. When he talked about it with Heinrich Schwarz, the commander of Auschwitz, he said that it would be good to move the most brutal acts of torment of prisoners behind the walls of the concentration camp. Nevertheless, this case, as I said, it was absolutely unique, and the prisoners perhaps might have the chance to at least to be treated better from a certain group of the Germans. Most of them did not react. They pretended not to see killings or beatings on the construction site. Perhaps they did not know what could they do in this situation. Then there was a large number of civilian workers from the Western Europe, including Frenchmen, Belgians, Dutchmen, workers from Norway, from Italy, from Bohemia, even from Spain. So they were all segregated into different categories, namely those workers who came from the countries friendly to the Third Reich were treated better, they lived in the better camps, better barracks. They became somehow a part of the German staff of the factory. That meant that they could participate in certain cultural events organized by the social department of the factory. They would receive certain bonuses in the form of the bottle of wine from time to time, certain vegetables, and so on. While the French workers and Belgians and people from those countries who were occupied by Germany, their position was slightly lower in this hierarchy, in the structure. Then there were Poles, and probably on the very bottom, the workers from the western parts of Soviet Russia, so-called Ostarbeiter. So they have the different possibilities, first of all, to collect some food and then to give it to the prisoners. That was most important. In case of Polish workers, particularly those who live in the area of Oświęcim, they have more options, more opportunities to bring some more food to the factory. For example, they could explain it to the guards that they wish to bring some more bread for the breakfast to the construction site. These were many such cases of contacts between concentration camp prisoners and civilians. However, we must remember that on average the workers were sometimes hungry and they had to take care about their families, about wives and children, and their resources were very limited. Nevertheless, if we look at the punishment orders that were issued by the administration of the concentration camp, we can find there a number of cases of prisoners who were arrested, who were in case when the SS guard discovered some slices of bread. In these cases, the prisoners tried to explain that this bread was stolen from the civilian workers. It's interestingly enough because I believe that in most cases prisoners simply received this bread from the civilians, but they didn't want to betray them in this way, to protect them somehow. And there was also a group of British prisoners of war which was very special on the construction site. Namely, of course, they were prisoners, they were guarded by the Wehrmacht guards. However, their situation was better than many other civilians in Monowitz because they would receive food parcels via the Red Cross. And in this way, they had at their disposal British cigarettes, chocolate, extremely rare and expensive, so they could buy almost everything on the black market in the factory, and in this way they had more food at their disposal. So again, in the SS documents we may find many punishment reports about prisoners who were walking around the working places of British prisoners of war. In this way, prisoners expected to receive something, some food from the British.
Had the fact that prisoners of Monowitz basically work outside the camp, of course in the guarded compound, but they are outside and they have contacts with civilians on the terrain that is in constant development, had it give them some possibilities of escapes, for example?
Some prisoners escaped from Monowitz even in the first very initial period of existence of the factory, when they had to walk from Auschwitz to the construction site. Some of them had a chance to escape, for example, when they worked around the factory, particularly when they had to take positions of German anti-aircraft guns that defended the factory against bombings of American airplanes in 1944. And even later, they worked on the huge piece of land on the site of the factory when the number of potential hiding places was much higher than it was in Birkenau, for example, when prisoners had to work on the open field. So these were the advantages of the site, and the prisoners could use these hiding places during the escape and to spend there a day or two or more waiting for the end of searching actions. And thanks to the fact that they had contacts with the civilians, or more contacts with the civilians, sometimes they could count on their help. Particularly, many prisoners escaped from Auschwitz in the middle of 1944. That led to a certain irritation of the commander of Monowitz. He even gave instructions to German and Polish capos that they should supervise prisoners more carefully and to report about every single case of potential preparations for the escape. So that was perhaps another factor that led administration of Auschwitz for the mass evacuation of non-Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz to concentration camps in Germany in the second half of 1944.
Both in Auschwitz I and in Birkenau, there were slightly different systems or places where people were punished and different kinds of punishments, and also places of execution. Has the Monowitz camp also developed its own either system or places where people were punished and executed?
At the beginning, the way of punishing prisoners was virtually the same. Anyone who opposed the guards or the capos was beaten, sometimes to his death. We can find in the Totenbuch, in the death book of Monowitz camp, that approximately 8% of all cases of death were registered not in the camp itself, but on the working places. That means that such a prisoner was beaten so far by the capo, or he might be shot by the guard while escaping. People who committed certain crimes, certain offenses against the regulations of the concentration camp, they usually would be taken to Auschwitz I to be interrogated by the Gestapo of the officers from the department number 2. And usually, if they attempted to escape, they were executed under the black wall on the yard between Block 10 and 11 in Auschwitz. Then, in 1943, with the arrival of the new commandant, Arthur Liebenhenschel, some of those who attempted to escape, they might be released back to the barracks. However, already after a few months, the SS introduced the practice to hang the prisoners who were arrested in these circumstances during the roll calls in the middle of the Monowitz camp. Namely, all prisoners of the concentration camp had to look at those who were to be killed. Almost all prisoners remembered these executions. Among them, for example, particularly in the execution of 3 young Jewish prisoners who prepared escape, and they were betrayed and sentenced to death. Witnesses remembered that because those prisoners shouted, "Kameraden, wir sind die Letzten," the colleagues, we are the last ones, "Rise your heads up," something like that. So that had a very strong impact on the morale of the prisoners of the concentration camp.
You mentioned the fact of bombardment, that IG Farben plant was bombed by the American bombers. What can we say about the bombardments there?
The only reasons for the organization of such bombings, that was the fact that Allies, and namely the Americans, wished to reduce the production of synthetic fuel in Germany. We must remember that IG Farben plant in Auschwitz was divided into two sectors, two parts. The first, in which Germans wished to produce a synthetic rubber, which was essential for German war economy. But in the second part, fuel that was called isooctane, that was a very sophisticated kind of petrol used by the German Luftwaffe. These were the reasons why the Americans decided to attack the factory. There were 4 such bombings, 2 of them heavy, over 100 flying fortresses or B-24 attacking the factory in Oświęcim, and the escort of the P-51 Mustang fighters. So these were very serious bombings, and fortunately for the prisoners and even for the slave workers, the factory was not ready yet. And assuming that the process of production required highly explosive materials, gases, so that was probably only the reason why the factory did not blow up simply. So nevertheless, the bombings resulted in many casualties, many people were killed, including the Auschwitz prisoners. These bombings had a certain impact on the piece of work on the construction site in Monowitz, and finally, in the end of the year, the IG Farben people believed that they would be able to begin the production of the basic product, the synthetic rubber, in the end of January, and to reach the highest output in December 1945. Ironically, the factory was to be opened precisely at the moment when the Russian troops approached to Auschwitz in the end of January 45. So practically the IG Farben wasted about $500 million of Reichsmark in vain, and the factory did not produce anything at all.
A side effect of the bombardments was the reconnaissance documentation, and thanks to the photograph taken from the air that was supposed to analyze the location of the plant and analyze the results of the bombardment, we also have unique photographs of the Auschwitz system discovered after the war, but for us it's a very important source of information.
Yeah, because each time it was necessary to, first of all, to take a series of good quality photographs of the area before the bombing, to point out the particular targets for the pilots of the bombers. And after each bombing, again, it was necessary to estimate the scale of damages on the construction site. So there was many such missions, and thanks to them, we've got many photographs not only of the factory, but also all these camps located around it, the city of Oświęcim, and the concentration camps in Auschwitz and in Birkenau. Why? Because the technique used at this time of filming the target required a certain time, namely the pilot switched on the camera slightly before he reached the target, and he switched it off after he took the photographs of the factory. So in this way we've got very detailed photographs of Birkenau, even including such ones with trains on the ramp in the middle of the Birkenau camp, and including very important photographs of burning peats and the clouds of smoke over the northern sector of Birkenau, which are very important for many reasons. First of all, to combat the crimes by deniers, for example. The problem was that during the second bombing, the Luftwaffe began to use certain smoke generators that make it possible to obscure the entire territory of the factory, the clouds of the smoke. So pilots, in some cases, they had to drop the bombs on the basis of the estimations, and some bombs hit the city, and some bombs even explode on the other side of the Sola River, very close to the concentration camp.
The fate of the prisoners of Monowitz at the end of the camp's functioning is very similar to all the system We have evacuation marches, the death marches, and finally the Soviet army liberated the camp. And of course, when we talk about the Auschwitz system, the people responsible for the crime are the SS, but is in the situation of Monowitz and the cooperation between the SS and the IG Farben, to what extent can we say that IG Farben is also responsible for the mistreatment and death of the prisoners of the concentration camp?
That was a subject of numerous discussions. After the war, some people claimed that was only because the support from the big industry in Germany before the war, Hitler was able to initiate aggressive wars. Perhaps to a certain extent that's true, because thanks to the new technologies developed in Germany before the war, it was possible to produce a synthetic petrol, for example. That was essential for the German armored divisions, for the Luftwaffe, and so on. In the case of Auschwitz, that was another factor, namely the fact that the IG Farben hired a large number of Auschwitz inmates, over 20,000 people altogether. And some people said that the owner of the factory is responsible for his workers. In this case, people from the management of IG Farben should be responsible for the death of Auschwitz inmates. Of course, that is true in many respects. First of all, the leaders of the IG Farben, the directors and chief engineers, did not protest while they could see the beatings of prisoners on the construction sites, and not only by the capos or SS men, but also by their own men, by the foreman. Secondly, there was a number of initiatives raised by IG Farben which led to physical exhaustion of the prisoners and to their death. Because with the arrival of first prisoners to the newly constructed camp in Monowitz, very quickly the people of IG Farben began to realize that there is a large number of prisoners who were so exhausted after spending some time on the construction site of the factory that they could not work any longer. And that was, for the people of IG Farben, these sick prisoners represented a certain burden only. And they did not care about the proper treatment. They did not want to sacrifice more barracks for the needs of the hospital. And instead, they complained that so many prisoners brought to Monowitz cannot be used for the productive work. So, in order to find a solution, they met with Gerhard Maurer, who was, as I said, responsible for employment of prisoners, and they concluded that all those sick prisoners who could not be taken into account as potential workers, they should be regularly being brought to Birkenau for treatment or to the main camp. So, and immediately replaced with the new ones, healthy and strong. So that had to be clear for these IG Farben representatives, the members of the staff, the directors of the company. What does it mean, this transfer to Birkenau to the prisoners? But they did not protest it because for them more important was the cheap labor of the concentration camp inmates. So that was probably the reason why during the trial of IG Farben directors after the war before the American military tribunal, among all IG Farben managers, those who were in touch somehow with IG Farben work in Oświęcim, they received the highest sentences, up to 8 years. However, unfortunately, with the beginning of the Cold War, all these people were released from jails and they continued their career because they were highly specialist professionals in the chemical industry after the war. That was only one unpleasant situation for them when the press at the beginning of the 60s, with the beginning of the rising interest of the German public opinion with the stories of war criminals, the press began to publish these photographs from the visit of Heinrich Himmler in Monowitz in 1942. And that was a group of engineers from IG Farben visible on these pictures together with Maximilian Faust. He explained that, well, this was not his guilt, because at this time the director of the factory, Mr. Dürfeld, was not present there, so he had to be the guide for Heinrich Himmler. Nevertheless, in most cases, they simply were retired and they had never been punished in Germany after the war.
You can find all our On Auschwitz podcasts at www.auschwitz.org/podcasts.